What we do in our research paper is we look at the IPO market, so firms that aren't publicly traded yet, but are going public on the New York Stock Exchange or the Nasdaq, and we look at the price that they go public at, and sort of their future returns and the volatility or risk associated with those companies, and then we correlate those measures with the amount of disclosure that the firm has at the time of its IPO. So there was a recent rule that came out back in 2012 called the JOBS Act. And the JOBS Act allowed firms to reduce the amount of information that they provide to investors. So, a lot of your viewers or your readers are probably familiar with, SEC filings. You've got to file an SEC financial statements, all these sorts of accounting statements. What the JOBS Act does is it reduces the amount of information that the firm is required to provide to the equity market before going public. And a natural question is, when you reduce the amount of information, are you increasing sort of the risk of the company? How do investors respond to that? And so we try and answer that question by looking at see what actually happens after the regulation. What we end up finding in the study is that after the JOBS Act, the IPOs that are going public are actually substantially riskier. So if you just think about imagining a world in which the SEC requires all of the IPOs to go through a screening process and issue these mandatory disclosures, and then the legislative branch of government comes along and says, well, let's actually sort of scale that back. Let's only require them to do 2 years worth of screening as opposed to the prior 3 years. So you can imagine that's going to have the effect of potentially bringing different companies to the market. So the analogy would be, you go to a used car lot, and suppose the government requires that when you purchase a used car, the car dealer has to give you basically a spec sheet on what the car's been doing, what the car's life was. And then the government comes along and says, well, we're not going to require that anymore. Car dealers can do it voluntarily. So now when you go to the car dealer, there's some cars have the spec sheet and other cars don't have the spec sheet. What do you infer about the cars that don't offer you, or the car dealers that don't offer you, the spec sheet? And so this is what we call a lemons problem, where you have sort of companies that aren't disclosing as much anymore. And the question is why are they not disclosing much anymore? Because now you've taken a mandatory rule and you've made it voluntary. And we find that those companies that don't disclose, are indeed much riskier. And so that's sort of the key punchline of the study is when you observe a firm scale back its disclosure, they're doing that for a reason, and investors sort of become more uncertain, and that generates risk for the company. We were actually surprised by the magnitude of the effect that we saw. There's really two schools of thought when it comes to, reduction in disclosure. One school of thought is that, government requirements and regulations for disclosure are burdensome on firms. And so they're excessively costly. You have to hire lawyers, you have to hire accountants, you have to hire auditors, to go over and to scrutinize your financial statements. And the purpose of the JOBS Act, at least the stated purpose by the proponents, was to reduce that cost and to allow more small businesses to go public, because now they don't have to pay as much fees to lawyers and to accountants and so we expected to see some effect, because you're going to see smaller firms entering the IPO market, and naturally those smaller firms will be riskier. But we were surprised at the magnitude of the effect that we found for even very large firms. So it wasn't just the small firms that were taking advantage of these provisions. It was also the firms with $1 billion in revenue. And even there, we found a substantial effect on the order of 6 to 12% change in what we call IPO underpricing, and I think a 5% shift in equity volatility, which is, in the grand scheme of things, that's a substantial cost to the company, even though it's not explicit. So, back to my earlier remark about the used car lot. Now you have a situation where the used car salesman is 2 cars, both red, same make, same model. One comes with the disclosure of its history, one doesn't. The used car salesman can't sell the car that doesn't come with the disclosure for the same price as the car that comes with the disclosure. So he marks the price of the car without the disclosure down. And so what we're measuring in our study is how much the bankers mark down the price of firms that don't have the disclosure. And that looks like between a 6 and 12% discount. And that's a substantial amount when you're thinking about a multi-million-dollar company. So that's a specific cost of the JOBS Act, even though it's not an explicit cost. It's not, saving money on underwriters. Well, I think until our study, there hadn't really been any evidence on what the effect of the JOBS Act was on the amount that the firm could raise, on underpricing, or on volatility. And so if you actually look at what the CEOs are saying in the popular press, a lot of CEOs are coming out in favor of it, especially the tech companies. So Twitter was one company who took advantage of this. And what they're saying is, it's saving us lots of money in terms of, we don't have to hire lawyers, we don't have to hire accountants, we don't have to have people prepare as many years of financial statements. And so we can save in terms of the explicit costs of preparing our disclosures with the SEC. The problem with that sort of reasoning is it ignores the implicit costs, right? So if I have these two cars and they're both red, they're both the same make and the same model, one comes with a disclosure of the car's history, the other one doesn't, I can't sell the car that doesn't come with the disclosure for the same price. So I could sell both cars for $5,000. That one car I can't sell for $5,000 because it doesn't come with a disclosure. I can only sell it for $4,500. So that you can think of as the difference between those two is a $500 implicit cost. So what we're finding is that while the JOBS Act is saving money on sort of preparation costs and is allowing smaller firms to go public because those firms no longer have these burdensome explicit costs, it's actually increasing the indirect costs because firms can't go IPO for the same prices that they could have before. They can't raise as much money when they disclose less. And so that creates an indirect cost that I think many practitioners and many managers aren't necessarily taking into account when they're making the trade-off about should they reduce their disclosure under the JOBS Act. So let's take the company first. So what the company is concerned about is presumably the company wants to maximize its IPO offer price. They want to sell the company for as much as they possibly can on the public market. So let's just assume that that's the objectives of the managers and that they're benevolent and that's what they're trying to do. So what we find is that the discount that investors apply to firms who are taking advantage of these reduced disclosure regulations is about a 6 to 8% discount. And sometimes it even goes as high as 12. So for example, if a firm is going public, perhaps it might be able to raise, let's say hypothetically, $100 million in its IPO. With a 6 to 8% discount, it's only going to be able to raise, say, 92% or 94% of that, which means it'll only be able to raise, say, $92 million. So the indirect cost of the reduced disclosure for that firm is about $8 million, between 6 and 12. Let's just pick 8 because it's in the middle. So they have to trade off that $8 million discount that investors apply against the savings that they get from not having to prepare additional disclosures, right? So add up all of the costs that you would pay for an additional year of audited financial statements, for additional year of litigation protection from your lawyers and whatnot, and see if it comes out to about between 6 to 12% of what you think your market value should be. That's under the story of the firm or the managers being benevolent and having shareholders' interests in mind and trying to sell the firm for the highest price. Another story, which is more cynical, is that one of the reduced disclosures is that the firm no longer has to disclose the compensation of the top 5 executives. It just has to disclose compensation for 3 executives. So another thing that the firm can do under this sort of legislation is that it can reduce the amount of information that it provides to the market about compensation. So on the one hand, that might shield the firm from sort of unjust public criticism of how lucrative the compensation deal is, which could be a good thing. But if that compensation is excess compensation, if the CEO and the top 5 guys are being paid too much, the market wouldn't actually know that at the time that that the firm goes public. So from the company's perspective, if they're trying to maximize their offer price, they need to trade off the explicit cost, which is the savings on the litigation, the accountants and whatnot, versus the indirect cost. And our paper is really about the indirect cost, which is this somewhere between 6 and 12% discount. So that's sort of what they need to take into account. So that's a new cost of going public that wasn't there previously. For the investors' side, we can think about this as there being sort of two broad types of investors: sophisticated investors and unsophisticated investors. So let's take unsophisticated investors first. These are the people who, maybe they have a cursory knowledge of financial statements and accounting information, if that. And one can argue whether unsophisticated investors should even be taking part in the IPO or not. But let's just assume that there are some unsophisticated investors who are sort of investing in IPOs. We certainly saw that during the tech bubble of the 2000s. These investors are getting less information from the firm. So relative to the sophisticated investors, we think that they're actually worse off, because the sophisticated investors can make up for any lack in public information by collecting private information. Whereas unsophisticated investors, they can't go out there and collect private information. You can think of, like your grandmother or your mom or your dad being one of these sort of unsophisticated investors with rudimentary understanding. They may or may not even realize that the amount of public disclosure that the firm is providing has shrunk. What that means is that the sophisticated investors, let's talk about, the big investment banks, the underwriters, they can get all of the information that they want from either other sources or from the firm. So their information set, we think, is generally unchanged, whereas what's changing is the information set of the unsophisticated investor. And this is one reason why we think the SEC was pushing back on making these new rules that Congress mandated them to do, because the SEC's mission is really to protect the individual investor. And anytime you have a reduction in the amount of public information, individual investors generally do worse. This is why we had these rules in the first place, to mandate firms to disclose as much as they could. So let's go back to the car example. You've got an auto mechanic who's going to the car dealership lot. He's your sophisticated investor. He sees the two cars. They're the same make, same model, same color. Sees one with the disclosure, sees the other one without the disclosure, right? He can detect without the disclosure whether that car that doesn't have the disclosure is actually a good car or not. Whereas, if I go to the used car lot, I would not be able to tell the difference between a good car and a bad car. I'm going to rely on the disclosure to tell me that. So sophisticated investors don't rely on the disclosures as much as the unsophisticated investors, and so sophisticated investors aren't hurt as much when the disclosure gets removed. Well, I want to be clear, the JOBS Act has many, many different titles and covers more than just disclosure by IPO firms. It does a lot of different things. It changes the rules for crowdsourcing and crowdfunding of projects. And so there's a lot of different faces of the JOBS Act that we don't really examine. We just picked out this sort of one provision or one title of the JOBS Act and examined its effect. So I don't want to say that the entirety of the Act is necessarily harmful or beneficial. We're just picking one little aspect of the Act and looking at how that affected the IPO market. Documenting that there are perhaps unintended consequences, or maybe even intended consequences of the Act. What's next, I think, is the Act has been relatively new, so the body of literature is just starting. There's only one published paper on the JOBS Act. I have this paper, and there's a couple others that are just starting up. But anytime you have a firm that reduces or chooses to reduce the amount of information it provides, whether it be about its compensation arrangements with its executives, whether it be about its accounting performance, whether it be about management discussion and analysis, that's going to have a ripple effect on all kinds of other intermediaries that rely on public information. So are now credit rating agencies going to have to rely on different sets of information? Are equity analysts going to have to rely on different sets of information? So, we just looked at, you could think of like the market consequences, how it gets into price and how it gets into volatility, but we haven't actually looked at, well, how does it affect all of these different intermediaries that are relying on the firm's disclosures and public information. And so I think that's where sort of the next step would be for examining sort of the first two titles of the JOBS Act, which is what we do, which is about a reduction in disclosure.